This is a Dynamics 365 podcast focusing on the ingredients of a successful Dynamics 365 practice. Your host is Business Solution MVP Mark Smith, otherwise known as NZ365 Guy. Over the coming weeks, I'll be interviewing seasoned professionals from various parts of the world, talking about what it takes to be successful in a Dynamics 365 practice. For more information on this interview, show notes, feedback, and resources mentioned, or to suggest a guest for future episodes, please go to nz365guy.com/podcast. Thanks to Maplytics for sponsoring the Dynamics 365 Practice Podcast. iNorgic is a leading Microsoft Gold Dynamics CRM ISV, delivering best-in-class Dynamics 365 solutions through unparalleled offerings of service and add-ons. Its flagship product, Maplytics, is a market-leading certified for Microsoft Dynamics 365 geoanalytical mapping app that empowers users with powerful map visualization and routing capabilities to drive better sales, improve business processes, and engage right customer at the right time. Hi everyone, I'm here with Steve Scarbrough, and in this episode we're going to focus on the customer in the Dynamics practice. Steve is a general manager at Intergen, a key strategic leadership role, assisting the country leadership to build the overall strategy in New Zealand, helping clients achieve successful business outcomes through strategic applications like the Dynamics 365 platform. Steve, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
So Steve, can you tell us a bit about your history so far and your career working with Dynamics?
Yes, Mark. So started off my career in the accounting space and went on to become a chartered accountant before ultimately, starting to realise that the thing that really, drove me and my why was actually about business change and what technology can do to enable that. So ultimately, after that period of time working in finance, I initially worked as an application consultant and actually implemented Navision as it was in those days before moving on to become an independent consultant. So most of the time I was helping customers select, implement, and in some case troubleshoot some deployments that hadn't gone so right, and often actually working between them and vendors and trying to mend some relationships at times. The last 9 years have been with Intergen. I really enjoyed my time here and been in sort of client-facing roles and more recently leadership roles, really working with customers to get the most from Dynamics.
Yeah, brilliant. So in this episode, we're focusing on the customer. Can you give us an example of a highly successful customer engagement and comparing that to an unsuccessful engagement, and kind of what were your lessons learned?
Absolutely. Let's start with a highly successful one. So we had a recent fairly rapid deployment of Dynamics 365 for customer engagement, and really the customer came to us with a fairly short window to implement the solution to effectively look after lead and sales management on the back of a major national campaign, their biggest campaign of the year that they were launching. And I think part of the success of that project was the fact that we had a very strongly engaged executive, in fact on both sides. And because we had a short runway and we knew we just had to get the basics in, that kind of agile and MVP focused meant that we all stayed very, very focused on a 3-week deployment that effectively delivered those needs. And went really well. And now we're into sort of phase 2 to really optimize off the back of that.
So what were the key things around the success you felt in that execution?
I think right from day one has been clear that we did have a tight time frame and we all therefore needed to be very practical with that. It was interesting, the entire team as part of kickoff, theirs and ours, rated our chances of success in delivering in the time frame. And interesting, it was only the senior supplier from our side and the sponsor from their side said they thought 100% chance of being successful. Everyone else in the team had differing, less successful views, I guess. Yep. And I guess what it showed is those two leaders were going to take ownership and help everyone else, not only buy into the process but make sure we got there. So that was probably one of the most critical things for me.
Brilliant. Okay, so now balancing that with an unsuccessful, and perhaps you can kind of, what were the parallels and the things to avoid, if you like?
It's interesting. We often hear about, CRM in particular and lots of failures. I guess, failure is a very strong word for me, and I'm pleased to say we haven't had any systems that I know of that were sort of turned off or never went live. But what we can see sometimes is that actually less benefit is realised that the customer expected, or we get poor adoption. And generally for me, there's sort of 3 things that might drive those. Is situation where we really don't get engagement with the actual end users during the project. They're sort of kept away from the project, and at the time they land with a solution, there's some real dysfunction around what the reality of the day job is versus someone who was representing them on the project. So that's probably one we watch out for. I also think a lack of clarity around the benefits expected. I think, where businesses just do things because they feel it's right and know it's going to be good for them versus actually putting a stake in the ground of what the outcome is they need to achieve. And I know in particular, one company we worked with said that their rule was 5-5-5. So 5 minutes prior to going into a store to prepare themselves, 5 minutes in store to sort of engage with the customer and get the results, and then 5 minutes afterwards to follow up on things. And just having that really strong view of what they needed to do in their case actually helped them be successful. I guess the last bit for me around sort of where we see some of these less successful is failing to really define a go live scope or MVP that compels the user to actually use the system. And so for me, if I ever meet customers with CRM in particular who talk about just wanting to deploy contact management, my concern is how's that actually going to stick? Because it's very easy to avoid the use of the system. So I guess for me, looking to, engage with the leaders and say, let's make sure as you look at the scope of what you're deploying, it compels people to use the solution because it actually drives an outcome in their own role, but also to balance the benefits the enterprise will get versus the benefits that individual user will get, because if you give value on both sides, there's a much greater chance of success.
Yeah, brilliant. So you can tell me about customer engagement. Like, do you have a set practice or best practice, if you like, around journey mapping and how you onboard a customer, how you get the stakeholders, aligned, if you like, between your organization and theirs, and really get that, the synergy? Or do you have a set plan, or how do you go about it?
Yeah, I guess we have a range of processes which we use, some of which are internal and some of which customer facing, to really make sure that we understand enough about the customer to make sure we're right for them. And I guess we have a particular sort of customer type where we know we can deliver the best value because of the way they want to trust and engage with us, and really sort of, we turn up in the same team rather than sort of an opposing sides of a table. Yeah. There's also a tool that we use when we first start engagements that sort of supplements the kickoff process, which is really about getting the two teams together and actually each team sharing what they need from one another, so sort of what they offer and what they expect. And it's a really nice way to start to sort of work out where the gaps might be in terms of the detail of what people are actually expecting the day they start the project versus potentially how we intended to move forward, or maybe the way it's been communicated on one side or another. So that's quite a nice tool just to make sure we kind of get the team together very early on. Yeah, good. So New Zealand being a diverse market, and particularly perhaps industry and company size, from my experience working in the market, do you treat customers like, give us an idea of your typical customer, are they, size, industry, that type of thing, and then do you onboard or engage them differently based on that? Yeah, so to give you an idea, I guess because of New Zealand being a fairly small country, we don't necessarily narrow down to just a couple of industries at Intergen. We work across most of the major industries that are strong in our country. And I guess if I look at Intergen, the customers who we work with most would be what I would call the corporate, sort of mid-market up to below our really big organisations. But we also work with smaller growth organisations below that and some of the really large organisations in New Zealand, and in fact some of the sort of internationally renowned brands globally as well. So we kind of span a lot of different levels, but actually for us it's more that kind of large corporate who have got a real change that they need to make in their business to improve things. In terms of how we engage them, I guess there's a lot of common threads, and that sort of builds off our company values, and when we talk about what we call our thinking forward customer framework. But there are certainly differences for me, and I guess what we see in the larger companies is that they typically have a more complex architectural environment. And on top of that, we typically deal with many more stakeholders, and often quite a distributed stakeholder group rather than just being in sort of the one place we're working with them. So what we typically see with those larger customers is the need to focus on a deeper level of technical solution and engagement governance, and really staying connected at that executive level, but also, I guess, using that mentality of thinking forward and saying, in a couple of months, what will be happening, and have we all got our ducks in a row to make sure we get things right?
Yeah, brilliant. So, with the diverseness of the customer base that you're dealing with, how do you make sure that, I know you would have an engagement plan as an individual, but how do you make sure that translates into your team, that they're, if you like, sticking to the Intergen way of engagement so you can have those best practices and success?
Yeah, so I guess with our major customers, we do have kind of plans about what we're looking to achieve with them, and that covers everything from who are the main people in the client and sort of how they like to work with us, little preferences they might have in terms of the way they, talk about a customer or a patient or a student and bits and pieces like that. And I guess what we've put in place alongside those teams that come in and out is there's sort of internal briefing sessions as well as customer kickoff to make sure we hand over clarity of outcome and what we're trying to achieve and what benefits we expect to release. And we also invest in our own sort of regular internal sync-up sessions, particularly with customers where we are working across a number of technologies together, and give everyone in the team to kind of share what's going on and I guess, collaborate and correlate what's happening on the ground and make sure we're always sort of at our best and we're not leaving gaps between the different things that we do.
Yeah. So do you establish regular rhythms of engagement with the customer and then also internally around maybe debriefing what your current stage or state of the engagement is, just so you're making sure that those comms are happening?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I guess one of the things that I also sort of really suggest and value with my team and also encourage others to do is the water cooler or the coffee machine chats that we have with our consulting team and just checking in and asking how things are going and just making sure that, that's correlating to what a project manager or a lead solution architect is saying about kind of the health of the project. And I think those lots of small conversations and amongst the more formal practices really helps us to, avoid those little things that can turn into larger things if they're not dealt with quickly.
Yeah. So what have you found that drives, if you like, the greatest customer success in the Dynamics business?
Well, the main thing for us is we actually looked at this concept of when we're at our best. So we profiled over a couple of years the top 10 projects that we felt delivered the best outcome for our customers and the best experience for our customers. And what we tried to do is talk about what were the things we may have done differently or better in those engagements. And effectively out of that came a set of guide rails, which we call our Thinking Forward framework. And really the idea is that helps individuals coming into our business, because we can't tell them, we can't have a policy about how a lot of the stuff works. There's certain methodologies, but this is that kind of individual's behaviour with a customer and with their colleagues and sort of how that kind of creates that really great team environment. So, there's quite a lot of detail in behind that. It's probably a little bit of our secret sauce, so I won't go into it much deeper than this, but really it's imparting their understanding of how our values manifest in behaviours with customers and therefore create this really nice environment for success.
Yeah, I like seeing that you've got a specific framework that you're operating to. Specifically, I find it affects how other staff in your own organisation know how to act and engage. So there's that consistency of brand. Very good, very good. I'd like to look at a not so successful project and the customer relationships, whether they deteriorated. You don't need to be specific about who, what, or where, but in the length of career you've been going, as myself, there's been times when sometimes there's misalignment with the customer. Can you give us an example, perhaps, of a less than successful, and then how do you handle it?
Yeah, I guess, we all get projects that become challenging at different times. And so one of the things we try and create up front is to create a kind of many-to-many relationship within those businesses, because I think that really helps us to be able to, have that conversation at different levels. We also like to talk up front with customers about what's really important to them on a particular project. So we talk about the project sliders. So, for instance, is it quality or timeline or budget or scope? That's the sort of big focus here, and often we find there's a couple of those pieces that sort of come together as the customer's critical piece, because that often helps us have the conversation with the customer about whether they are open to discover new value and sort of pay for change through the project, or whether actually they don't have a lot of commercial flexibility and they really do just need to stick to what they've planned. Yeah. If we know this up front, we can translate that into our, customer activities. We can brief the team, and it helps our consulting team kind of make sure they deal with any areas which are starting to slip a little bit outside what we agreed to do. probably the big one of these for me recently was a situation where we had some in-flight activity, and actually we were having some behaviour which was really challenging from one of the senior leaders in the business we were dealing with. And thankfully, because we had created those kind of many-to-many relationships, I was able to connect with the CEO, and over a beer, I had to share with him a conversation I've probably not really ever had with the CEO to say, hey, we have some real concerns about this individual, and here are some of the examples of why we think he's not actually doing the right things to protect and help you in your business. And it was quite a nerve-wracking conversation because you don't really like to have to be in that position, but actually the feedback I got on the day was, thank you, Steve, that really does correlate to a lot of things I've seen over the last 6 months and validates some grave concerns I've also got. So they really appreciated that, and you know, sadly that individual moved on, but actually it did help that leader appreciate that, you know, some people don't understand technology, and technology changed the way we do, and if we make the assumptions they do, we're kind of not helping them as much as we should. So in that case, I was just able to kind of help him make sure that he realised that there were certain things that were missing in terms of their strategy, planning and execution, and certainly we've had a much better relationship with that customer, with someone coming in who's been able to kind of really put some of those, I guess, foundations on the client side in place to match the way we hope to work with them.
Yeah. No, I've had a similar situation, and what I've found interesting is that generally when you have those hard discussions about perhaps individuals that are negatively affecting a project, you're generally not speaking about something that other people haven't picked up on as well. And so it's often, you know, a validation even for them that that you have those talks, you know, upline and get that engagement. So it's very good. So
absolutely.
What about rescuing projects or having a customer come into your organization? It might be that they've worked with another partner unsuccessfully. It might have been they tried to run their own Dynamics project and felt it got away on them. How do you bring perhaps a customer that's, you know, they're not excited at this point, they've got a problem and they want to solve it? How do you turn them around and get that, if you like, back on course?
Yes, in fact, Mark, one comes to mind that you referred to us many, many years ago here, because Intergen probably has a reputation as being a good rescue partner. Yeah. And I must say it's really hard work, and it's fair to say our team would always prefer to do the good job up front than actually have to clean up after another partner. But to me, the key is to kind of talk really straight when you first get in the room with them, to explain that, you know, we want to work with you to rebuild trust in the technology, because that's usually a big part of where things have got to. We also want to work with you to rebuild trust in a technology partner such as ourselves. But we've also got to be clear that actually it can take time, and in some cases quite considerable time, to fix and turn things around, and actually there's a level of investment that might be required to do it. But just making sure they appreciate that, you know, whilst we're here to help, you know, this is not, we don't have a magic wand and we ain't going to be able to wave it, so actually sort of getting down to the detail. And I guess what we also then do is say, and it depends on the nature of the rescue, but in many cases it's about creating a roadmap of activity and actually trying to find some really good quick wins quite, you know, pretty much immediately for that customer, because that's how that trust gets built again and we can start doing small things to move things forward. It's typically not ideal to have to come in and do a complete sort of re-implementation and expect the customer to trust you from day one with what is potentially a second investment in something they thought they were going to get the first time. So, you know, I guess treading carefully, being really straight about what's involved and trying to find some good results quickly would be the key things we do. We also do have a specific process around health checks and transitioning customers into our support environment. So we set up for success, and whilst the Kiwi way is she'll be right, is not necessarily our way when it comes to that, because we know if someone's going to ring our service desk, they are expecting us to know about them and about their solution and do a good job.
Yeah, exactly. So just to digress slightly, because I remember now the project you referred to, and from memory back then, it was one of the key things I called out when I investigated it was around a lack of project management over the actual project. And have you seen that generally projects and customer engagements that don't end up going well, what do you see as the key triggers that really got them to that point in your experience?
Yeah, I guess it's a range of things, and I think sometimes project management can be part of that. I think we get situations where someone who is project managing is potentially not only having to do a day job at the same time, which sort of doesn't allow them to, start the day thinking about the projects first, which you need to. But secondly, they're often also playing a role of the SME or subject matter expert. So, they get, really crunched in certain phases of the project. So we do spend time with customers talking about the resourcing and roles they need on a project and what the profile of activity looks like, particularly as you get into the back end of a project, which is the time for me when the kind of the effort and activity really switches between kind of consulting organisation versus customer as they're having to, data migration, testing, training, those sorts of things. So I guess try and make sure we've clearly explained to them what's expected of them, and actually not being afraid to call out when we see those things not happening, or when we're seeing a situation where we've been told scope's very clear, and then we get into a workshop and the people who have come into that workshop haven't been given the same boundaries, and therefore we've got that kind of mismatch. So, to me, it's roles and responsibilities, and it's fair to say on the projects that go really, really well for us, it's where all of those roles and responsibilities from executive sponsor down through project manager or product manager, as we have in sort of a Scrum Agile methodology, everyone's doing the right things and doing their part and working as one team, and we come out of those projects and everyone feels really good about them, but sometimes, you think you've got those pieces in place, but you appreciate over time that people don't actually understand what the role needs to do. So one of the things we've talked about here is it's never acceptable for us to say that a customer or a certain individual in a role didn't do their job. We need to coach them on how that job works and continue to do that till we see a result. If we really don't think they're going to get there, that's when we kind of escalate up through the project group to the next level. But ultimately, it's about us taking accountability to help them with their role, because we know that will help us be much more successful.
Yeah, brilliant. How do you validate that your staff are customer focused and really providing the consistent intelligent customer experience across your teams?
It's interesting. I guess at an enterprise level, we do use Net Promoter Score, or NPS, and that's fairly brutal. At the end of the day, Kiwis are pretty good at going, they're giving someone a 7 or a 8 versus a 9 or a 10. So that's kind of our more holistic way to measure across our active customers how we're doing. Ultimately, I also encourage the people who are in sort of the non-project roles and talking about kind of our sales leaders and some of our practice managers and myself, is actually asking the customer on a regular basis how things are going, checking in post-project, and just sort of making sure that the experience is right. And when I talk to people about that thinking forward construct we have, I finish that by saying, so you now know what you should expect from us. And if you ever don't see that, the people in the room here care about that and we want to get it right, because we're only as good as the best person or weakest person in our team. And in a lot of cases, people don't arrive in consulting with those soft skills we need them to have to complement the technology skills they bring. So, lots of coaching and I guess also just being mindful that, some people are better at it than others. So the roles on the project need to sort of map to that.
Yeah. So what about how do you engage a customer then that, let's say they've come to you and they've chosen the product they want. They've said Dynamics 365 is what we want, and however they came to that decision they did. But you get into their business and you start looking at the way the business is operating, and you see that the tool, Dynamics in this case, is not necessarily going to solve their problem. They've got perhaps process, re-engineering that's needed. There's, even conflict in the business. I mean, in those situations where senior leaders don't agree with each other, and therefore, and there's this almost unrealistic expectation that by putting in a piece of software, it's going to solve their problems, and you can glaringly see that's not the case. How do you handle it? How do you engage?
Yeah, I guess, coming back to first principles, we'd make sure we had those chats very early with the customer and as soon as we saw it. But I guess outside of that, we are lucky here in that we've got some really excellent, I guess, business-focused enterprise architects and business analysts. And so often when we see that sort of thing, we try to, hopefully we capture it before we're starting to head into a main project, which is not defined to get the outcomes they've got. But in the cases where we do, we'll often ask to have a sort of separate session to kind of take them through what we call the art of the possible. Yep. And I guess really what we're trying to do is to bring to life the sort of things they're talking about, and also help them appreciate that actually Dynamics 365 is only one part of your architecture which will solve your business problems and your staff productivity and customer engagement activity. And actually, it's the leadership of the individuals involved and the mindset of where they're trying to take business practice and process in your own customer value proposition that really makes it work, and sort of trying to tie the two together to the point, to me, deploying Dynamics CRM from a sales execution standpoint, where you've got a sales leader who doesn't really believe in CRM, but it's kind of doing it because someone else has suggested they should, is doomed to failure. Because to me, having sat over a team who use CRM and forecasting, your disciplines and effort and focus on that is actually what brings that to life and makes the team realise how important it is in the business. Yeah. So for me, it really is trying to make sure we support them, but also not necessarily suggesting they stop and do current state process mapping, future state process mapping, because I can see that as quite a laborious approach these days. Generally, what we're trying to do is give them that kind of art of the possible or view of the future, and trying to get on and deliver things in small chunks and drive that kind of time to value ratio. Because ultimately, I think the idea of kind of process mapping your future state entirely without necessarily understanding how technology can really take it and enable it to a much greater degree than you may have planned is getting harder and harder with the, I guess, speed of technology improvement.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely seen that. In my experience. So I'm interested, just back to the difficult customers. A lot of people don't like talking about the difficult customers, but there's, in a lot of organizations, you do come across some customers that there are challenges on, and you, if you like, in your perception, the challenge is definitely on the customer side. So just to give you an example, I had a customer that had brought in a contract PM for the project. So in other words, the individual didn't necessarily have the DNA of that organization at any stretch, and they had their, perhaps their own agenda, what they wanted to achieve, and the project went into a tailspin over a course of a month or so, and it wasn't till senior engagement happened that the PM was identified as the reason why the project had been set back greatly from a time and rework perspective, and had to be engaged ultimately replaced on the project. But sometimes the customer doesn't have those people that are on board with the project, but they're almost like forced into, we've decided as a business we're going to implement this technology, but they're, sometimes they'll even go out of your way to make it not a healthy environment for your teams to operate in. How do you handle it?
Yeah, I guess we do sometimes have project managers who almost feel that their job is a contract-based kind of legal discussion, and so we try and get past that and make sure we put aside that kind of us and them type elements and really say, hey, look, we're actually here for a joint outcome together. Probably the best example I've got recently, and it's interesting, it's not necessarily a contracted PM nor actually someone who's not doing a pretty reasonable job on the project. The challenge for this project manager is he has come out of a functional area within the business we're working with, so he's actually probably one of their best SMEs. Yep. So on that basis, what we're seeing is someone who's fairly new to project management for a very large scale deployment we're doing, and is also on many occasions having to kind of dig in and sort of revisit his old life. I guess ultimately as well, what we're seeing is that he, on occasions, because he knows the business so well, is stepping into the shoes of the business decision makers to make decisions. So there's a couple of things we've done there. Is one, he's really time poor, and so we've typically really been getting alongside him, and our project manager's actually been kind of supplementing his kind of day-to-day duties and helping doing the joint pan and bits and pieces. We're also sort of every other day having our solution lead spend time with him as well, because we see he's so critical and we're at such a crunch point on the project that actually by supporting him on kind of that, the two members of the team on a day-by-day basis, we're actually really helping us understand where he's at, but also help him sort of progress things. Yeah. I guess the other thing we did with that is we did make it clear at executive level that actually he was time constrained and that he really, needed to let go and get others involved. And I think the challenge for that business is they're sort of mindful of that, and he's pushing things down, but that's not necessarily speeding things up. So, rather than a situation where, we need to bring someone else in, it's really about how we support him and how we coach him to make sure he does get the business to step up front and centre. And that way we hope we'll get the results we want. And, certainly he's developing as a project manager as we go, but I think that's kind of interesting when people are taken out of a business role into a project management role on a very large transformation project and they've never done it before. You are going to make mistakes and there is going to be a level of stress, which is not what you'd get if you knew how to do that and you'd been through it before.
Yeah, exactly. So another challenge I've come across, and I'm interested to see your opinion, is that you have your key stakeholder on the project. The project kicks off, and let's say a couple of months in, it's going very well. In fact, it's going so well that key stakeholder gets a promotion because it's been so successful. And then they move into a new role, and all their knowledge up to that point and representation of their company is gone, and you come in with their replacement, and the project is not as stable because this person has to get up to speed, and they're almost living in the shadow of the person representing the company. Have you come across that, and how do you handle your team still consistent but the customer's team changing?
Yeah, so we've probably had an example of this where we actually had a lot of change on both sides, and it was a relatively small and what appeared to be quite a straightforward project, and certainly started reasonably well defined. And I think what we had is we had a BA and a project manager change on the client side and the lead consultant change on our side, all within sort of about week 4 and 6 of a project, which was only going to be sort of 2.5 months. And so really what we found is with that change, we ended up having a whole lot of new stakeholders on client side come in and probably assume that there were other things that were going to come of the scope. We also didn't have the individual who'd been sort of, I guess, privy to all of those first-hand conversations. So we got into a situation where I think everyone was struggling to know what it was that was exactly agreed, and we were trying to work in a little bit more of an agile sense under this project. So rather than the weighty document that we may have had in a waterfall basis, we really just had kind of user stories with a reasonable amount of detail behind them, but probably not necessarily enough given the changes we saw. So we actually at that point had a bit of a stop meeting and sort of revisited things and confirmed things, but also asked the senior sponsor from the client side to help guide his team around the fact that we didn't have an open timeline and an open budget, and therefore, what can we do, team, to get this back online and moving? And it's fair to say it did end up with some delay and a little bit more commercial cost, but ultimately we delivered a solution that's gone really well with those individuals, and thankfully, because we sort of picked up on it quite quickly, we were able to, I guess, manage it before it got out of hand.
Yeah, brilliant. So what about you have the scenario that not necessarily, it might be a fixed price project as such, you get underway and all of a sudden you run your first range of workshops, the customer gets unbelievably excited about how powerful Dynamics 365 is, and all of a sudden they start developing a very long shopping list which they assume is just going to be delivered. How do you handle that risk of massive scope creep that they want everything?
Yeah, I guess, in the two different project types we do, and we're more often than not using agile methods rather than total agile, I guess. We very much use a parking space in the backlog, so we can actually say, hey, these things are not part of the original set of user stories we went into the sprints with. Let's put them on a backlog. And the neat thing we're finding about that is customers are generally either open to saying, let's do another sprint and grab some more value, or actually let's get live, and then they'll come back to us a month, 2-3 months later and say, hey, let's do another sprint or two to clean up the backlog. So we think that mechanism has created a little bit of flexibility there for customers to be a bit more comfortable. I guess waterfall projects are quite different in that, generally at that stage we've got quite definitive scope and costs, and what we sort of recognise with our teams is as and when you're seeing those sorts of things, for one, you kind of just need to call out that you're unsure as to whether that was part of the scope, and that, what we'll probably do is we'll set up a separate workshop to address those and just escalate through immediately and just work out from a customer perspective whether or not, I guess the individual was empowered to be adding that to scope and what the impacts might be, because whilst sometimes things look quite small on the surface, they may materially change the risk profile of a project, and therefore we do need to sort of re-engage at the next level up. So I guess training people on how to have those conversations with customers so it doesn't feel like that all they ever say is no, but that there is a way for them to sort of put those things onto a list and we get together, and we generally make sure we set up governance quite early in a project, like if not before we even do kickoff with the executives and we talk about these things. So I guess what we're trying to do there is make sure if we've got to go and have and we call them courageous conversations, that we've already built some rapport and reputation for sort of focusing on what the customer needs from us and the likes. And in most cases, we manage it really well. In some cases, we actually do pause the project and really get together and nut it out with a customer before we move forward, because we realise the goalposts are shifting, so significantly.
Yeah. So what does customer engagement look to you 6 months after the project's live? And I'm not meaning, from a remarketing to the customer and, if you like, growing share of wallet with them. I'm meaning more, once again, being in the industry a while, you hear stories where a partner will come in, do a project, and then it's almost like the customer can't find anybody that knew, on the partner organization knew anything about the project type thing. So how do you make sure that you stay engaged, the months following go live?
Yep. So one of the things we do is we generally we always have a consistent sales leader, and part of their role is to stay connected even after the project. But we also look to where we can maintain a sort of dedicated architect, and that's not necessarily full-time dedicated, but someone who is the human container for knowledge and understanding of that customer. So typically in that 6-month period, we usually expect a customer to be well and truly settled, but we're in at that stage double checking that the anticipated benefits are realised, because as we both know with technology, it's not just the technology change, it's how management take aim and sort of realise those through the work and effort they put in. And I guess we also try to double check with some of the people on the front line that they're actually enjoying using the system and it feels like it is giving them some results. So we sort of correlate kind of the adoption and benefits piece. We also try to encourage our customers not just see technology as a project and then sort of put it down and actually talk about a roadmap, which may be a 2 or 3 year period and various kind of workloads or areas of capabilities that they want to implement. Because what we're seeing more often than not now is most people's, I guess, initial plans are a much smaller chunk than they probably were sort of 5-10 years ago, with the view that they will continue to iterate and have a continuous improvement process. I guess we also start to really help the customer consider what they now have. So the classic one for me is, once you've got a system and it's 6 months old, there's some value in the data you've started to gather. So maybe that's a good time to talk about dashboards which would more effectively optimize kind of processing and management, or actually some of the bigger prizes in that space where we might be able to leverage, external data sets or even other internal data sources and, find some really interesting stuff with the correlation between certain sets of data. And that to me is kind of where people's eyes kind of light up, because they truly see that the system is actually delivering extra strategic value.
Yeah, brilliant. Do you see much difference between the customer profile of public sector or a government agency as opposed to, let's say, a customer that's in the not-for-profit space opposed to or contrasted against a commercial customer? So,
Yeah, certainly see that those three are quite different. I guess let's just start with the not-for-profit, because we do a lot of work in that sector, and it's quite heartfelt. We've done some great stuff for charities down here where we really have changed their proposition in terms of their ability to achieve their goals with the people they support. Generally, when we're working with those customers, we know that they have a very limited and specific pool of money to work with. So we need to be really mindful that there is not likely to be a lot of commercial flexibility. So we really need to get our game plan sorted up front and make sure we're all on the same page about that. But outside of that, I would almost say that they're similar to what we see in commercial, where commercial for me is more about time to value and I guess cost to value over risk. They still manage risk, whereas then when we get into public sector, it's almost a risk-led conversation with those customers, because they really do have that kind of front page concern. So I guess we see components of all, but to me it's charity is very less flexibility around the commercial sector really wanting to move fast, get value, get going, versus public sector, which will be much slower and much larger projects, partly because of the governance and expectations they have, and I guess their accountability to ministers and the stakeholders of the country.
Yeah. So customer expectations, have you seen over the last 10 years them change? And what does that look like?
Yeah, I think we have. I think, the whole consumerization of IT, so, if anyone who's got a mobile phone these days has I guess, been conditioned to the fact that, apps should be super intuitive and super usable, and they should just work, and I should not need training or other bits and pieces. So I guess what I do see a lot is we get that sort of expectation in, I guess, business deployments of technology. And I think it's a fair expectation. So what I'm often trying to do there with customers is talk about the concept of an expert system, so one that someone uses almost all day long, versus a kind of more casual user of a system. So for instance, someone who's working at an ERP system all day, if one of their processes they do every now and again is a little bit painful, they're going to live with it. If you take a process that someone does that hundreds of your staff do 2 or 3 times a week, it really needs to be super intuitive and app-like. So we are seeing instances at the moment where, as we sort of, I guess, dig down and work out use cases sit in that kind of really high use, must be easy to use, is we'll often do some real UX work around that particular component, because we know it's part of the success of the project is the fact that that can't be noisy and it must be easy. Yet if we've got someone who's an expert user dealing with a little process that's a little bit painful, we can probably all live with that. So, I guess contrasting those things. And I guess ultimately all customers these days are expecting technology to get easier. And I certainly like to think it is, but it's not easier if you don't have a really good plan up front as to where you're going. And that's kind of from a long-term architectural sense. So really making sure customers appreciate that whilst we can do lots of increments, we always need to have a big game plan that we're working to. Otherwise, those increments can still end up looking a little bit like one of the best-of-breed architectures we're often trying to unwind these days.
Yeah. So true. So what do you see happening in the next 5 to 10 years in the dynamic space, and specifically around how you'll engage with customers or the change in the customer profile? What does it look like? If you had a crystal ball, what would you predict?
And I think we're seeing early stages of this at the moment, Mark. So we're seeing that kind of less technical-oriented deployments to more consulting-led activity. And I guess where customers are actually really expecting leadership and not just necessarily technology leadership, but actually insights around the particular process challenge they're facing based on our experiences with other customers. And I think the nice thing with Dynamics 365 is because it's so configurable, we are seeing an ability to really optimize based on different industries and business requirements. So I guess for us to really thrive as we move forward is we can't end up in a situation like, for instance, Excel, where most people use 5% or less of its true capability.
Yeah, exactly.
We actually do need to get people to leverage all of what they've got in front of them. And so we have some playbooks we've put together around the technology sets we work in the dynamic space. And ultimately those playbooks are to educate our team from a sort of sales and conversational standpoint about what else should we be talking about. And it's sort of, I call them conversation starters. What sort of conversations should we have to help a customer lead to the path that actually they do have other capabilities and other pillars of excellence that they can deliver in their business.
Yeah.
I think the other thing we're going to see in our business is we're going to deliver a lot more of our expertise and our people as a service. So the concept where the customer wants an ongoing advisory and kind of change leadership role around the technology, but actually around the business stuff too. And I guess what we'll be looking to do is say, hey, look, it's very hard for you to find a really capable specialist in the market without paying an awful lot. Take some part-time regular help from our team, and actually what they'll do is come in and kind of work with you to replace that role. But also the good thing is they are still staying current because they're doing lots of other projects, even if your version is a bit older. They've also got a lot more exposure to different scenarios because of all the clients they've worked with. Whereas I think sometimes we see really capable people working in-house on technologies, once they've been sort of 2 or 3 years in the same place, they're starting to lose track of what the possibilities are because the technology just continues to move. And I guess for me, I'm also really interested to see where, bot and, integrated chat and some other things are going to do for us. Currently working a little bit on a conference we've got coming up and looking at AI and how well it lands. And I guess my experience with Drew, the Domino AI bot, was less than optimal. And I'm thinking, well, we've got a long way to go if we can't even order a pizza really easily and effectively. So, interesting space, but I think much harder than we think. I think the technology piece is the really easy piece in those, rather than the change and actually where to focus those tools so they're actually going to add value.
Yeah. Have you found with working and with customers for so long, and also on the flip side, seeing what's possible with the technology, have you found as an individual you've become more, or you have a higher expectation of how you are engaged so when you're the customer and that experience that you have, do you think your expectations are much higher because you know what's possible with technology?
Yeah, it is. And the contrast for me is I've had a bit of work done around home recently, and my expectation of tradespeople and sort of, seeing them as, a different version of the professional consulting folk, yet, the fact that some of them just physically don't get back to you around quotes or don't actually turn up at the time they said they would and that sort of thing. So I guess I've probably become quite a demanding customer in terms of my experience dealing with technology, but also the fact that, I'd be really disappointed if we failed to get back to someone when we said we would. I'm sure there are occasions when we do it, but ultimately we're about making and keeping promises. So I guess and also when I look at kind of technologies, I'm a classic where if in the consumer space I'm trying to use something and I just find it too difficult, I just literally turn off and move on and look for the next tool.
Yeah. I've found that definitely with myself, my demanding, if you like, is increased massively. Like a typical support thing, hired a car recently, got a response email. I emailed back to it and they said, "Oh no, sorry, you can't contact us through this channel. You need to go to this link and fill out these forms." And I was just like, what? Like, I'm the customer. I paid for the service. You can sort out what department it needs to turn up in your organization. And I gave you everything that, I'm going to give you. And I just think, technology, I know, just solves so much of this. And I find it frustrating when so many organizations are well behind.
Absolutely agree with that one.
Yeah. Okay, so to wrap up, a couple of quick fire questions I want to go through with you. What book do you recommend most to people working in Dynamics or considering working in Dynamics, and why?
So I'm going to throw you a curveball here because mine's not about a book. I guess I learn from doing and from others predominantly through my career, although I have done a bit of reading as well. And I actually would really encourage people to actually take the time to really engage with other people in their team, particularly if they're new and they're trying to learn, and clients to truly understand what works and what doesn't. I've always believed, for instance, that no consultant will ever actually become as expert on a person who lives and works with a system that's deployed in a client environment day to day. Our consultants have good knowledge, but they aren't the people that find those little small idiosyncrasies that only happen because you work with it, 5 days a week, 52 days a year. So sort of trying to listen, trying to chat and trying to understand. And I think for me is you will learn so much by sucking up the information from others around you, and that gives you the stories and the variety of understanding which allows you to give a customer an understanding of, if they do something, what the likely outcome is, because I think most customers are wanting more than just how to configure and make something work in the system. They're expecting, how do then we keep track of that and manage that, and to be able to share a specific example of a customer who had a challenge and how you solved it gives clients huge confidence in you. So for me, hey, read some books, but actually use the people and the strength around you to learn a lot about both the technology and how it applies to business.
Brilliant. So what's your favorite app and why?
It's funny, I've just moved into a more of a national role, so I've been travelling a lot. So I must say I do love the Air New Zealand app. It makes travel really easy for me. But the other one I've really sort of fallen back in love with is actually my TED apps. So it's got a download capability, so I find just for sort of smaller gaps on the planes before I can get my laptop out, it allows me to kind of break away from what I focus on day to day and discover new and interesting insights about lots of wonderful topics. So for me, that's been really kind of a nice way to sort of relax and zone out a little bit and understand something that's a bit different to what I normally look at.
Yeah. So funny you said that about in New Zealand as well, is that, when I was living there, it was that app, they seem to have got really right from day one. They invested well into it, and the New Zealand app's always been a fantastic, top quality built app. Couldn't agree more with you there. And TED Talks, I like they're 15 or 16 minutes long. Like they're bite size. They're great.
Absolutely. I'm about to try out the Oscar app on Air New Zealand as part of my research on AI too. So that's going to be interesting to see how that works and what it can provide in way of value. Brilliant.
Do you have any daily rituals that set yourself on the right path for success for a day?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm quite a structured person, but I probably don't in a business sense. I have some sort of methods I use throughout the day, but probably the big thing for me is every morning either myself or my wife make a coffee and we sort of sit and chat, and our golden lab is up on the bed, and apparently stroking an animal is really good for your stress. So that's kind of how we start our morning, chatting about the day and sort of warming up, and then, up we get and kids off to school and all that sort of stuff.
Brilliant. What recommendations do you have for people wanting a successful career in Dynamics that you didn't already cover with your learn as much as you can on a project and from the people around you?
Yeah, so that first thing is be willing to learn from everybody every day around you. I guess number two for me is I love the 5 whys theory. So the idea that, if you ask why 5 times, you'll actually really get to the nub of why someone was actually wanting to do something. And especially when it comes to requirements or things like that, I think you probably need to go too deep to really understand them at the best of times. So I think getting into that inquisitive sort of mode where you investigate, because in some cases you'll find that that's not a requirement that's required, because you'll really find out why they're doing things, or you'll actually find that there's more value you can add because you really know what's behind it. So to me, that's really important. And I guess the last one for me is when you hit a problem, because the reality is technology is difficult and working with customers can be a challenge, is to approach it from, I guess, the position of a player versus a victim mentality. So to give you an idea, a victim's a sort of person that might deflect and point at others and, that sort of thing, or just share their frustrations, where a player is the person who talks about we and it's the royal we and what are we going to do about it, and here's the positive ideas. And I think, it really differentiates for me the sort of people who are ultimately going to move up and get into leadership roles, someone who can kind of quickly work out in their career that, moaning and groaning and pointing fingers at other people isn't a way to I guess, engage and move forward. And, using that player mentality, I think, has been a big lesson I've learned over the recent years, and it's really helped me, I guess, bring people on a journey with me.
Yeah, fantastic. If you could redo anything in your Dynamics career, what would it be?
I think for me, reflecting on that question, which was a really good one that you posed, Mark, is starting my own business in this space rather than working for others was something that I probably would have looked back on and tried. Look, at the end of the day, I really love Intergen and that, but I think that's probably an option I could have considered, and I think because of the breadth of skills I've got, I could have probably been quite successful in that space.
Yeah, brilliant. So have you got any recommendations for other guests that, the focus of this podcast is around the Dynamics practice rather than the technology, because there's plenty of people on Serum Audio doing around the technology. Do you have any other people that would fit well with those list of, kind of target or focused areas of this podcast that I sent you?
Yeah, for me, Dylan Haskins, and I think, Mark, Dylan is a fellow MVP, but Dylan's, he works and leads our Auckland Dynamics team at the moment. It's one of my kind of leadership team in that group, but he's also run his own businesses, and I guess what I love, although some of the ideas he used in his past business are not really things that we could implement here, is some of the ideas he put in place in his own business around the working week and the concept of his fix-it voucher, which a customer who wasn't his could come and buy a fix-it voucher from him, but it was a fixed price, and if he fixed it in half an hour, it was his good, and if it took him a hell of a lot longer, it was his loss. And so I just think he has a really different view sometimes to the traditional time and hour based stuff that we do in our sector.
Brilliant.
And therefore I think you'll get some really good insight as to some of the things I know he would kind of love to do here, which we haven't necessarily been able to implement. But yeah, a good leader and a good thinker, so well worth a chat with him.
Brilliant. Steve, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Before you go, if people want to follow you online, where can they find you?
So probably the easiest would be via my LinkedIn profile. I'm pretty active on that and really open to people connect with me and or send sort of email to chat about things. And so it's Steve Scarbrough, and everyone gets Scarbrough wrong, so I might spell it for you, which is Scarbrough. And as I said, I'm kind of a business person that works in technology, so I'd classify myself more as a business geek than a technology geek, but really open to connect with people, share ideas. I'm trying to become more and more active with my blogging, and had a few successful articles out to date, and got 2 or 3 more in the process at the moment. So more than happy to connect with people heading off to Envision with Microsoft in a week's time. So looking forward to kind of seeing where their technology sets are taking business.
This has been a Dynamics 365 podcast focusing on the ingredients of a successful Dynamics 365 practice. Your host was Business Solution MVP Mark Smith, otherwise known as NZ365 Guy. For more information on this interview, show notes, feedback, and resources mentioned, or if you know someone who would be a great guest for future episodes, please go to nz365guy.com/podcast. Thanks to Maplytics for sponsoring the Dynamics 365 Practice Podcast.